7:21 a.m., underground parking garage at Orion Dynamics. Cold fluorescent lights. Mark Reynolds, 40 years old. Morning janitor, single father, mopping near a beaten muscle car. Elaine Carter, 38, new CEO, heels clicking, stops at the car. She laughs. That car is junk. Mark doesn't look up. Who allowed this scrap here? Mark speaks quietly. It's mine. Elaine laughs harder. Then the alarm screams. A $2 billion engine just died. Engineers panic. Elaine barks orders. Restart it, now. Mark sets down his mop and walks toward the test room. Mark Reynolds was 40 years old and invisible. Every morning at 6, he clocked in at Orion Dynamics. He mopped floors, emptied trash, wiped down windows. Nobody looked at him twice. He wore the same gray uniform for 6 years. Same badge, same quiet smile, same silence. But Mark wasn't always a janitor. 8 years ago, he was a lead engineer at a different company. High-performance engines, hybrid energy systems, cutting-edge research. He had a wife, Sarah, a daughter, Lily, just 1 year old then. Life was good. Life was bright. Then Sarah died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday. Mark couldn't breathe in that city anymore. He packed everything and moved here with Lily. Started over, started small. At his old job, Mark had been working on a revolutionary engine design. Clean, efficient, safe. But the company wanted to rush it, cut corners, skip safety tests, make the IPO deadline. Mark refused. He pushed back. They fired him 2 weeks later. No severance, no explanation. Just gone. Mark didn't fight it, didn't sue. He just needed health care for Lily, needed stability, so he took the janitor job at Orion Dynamics. It paid enough. It had benefits. It was quiet. Nobody asked questions. Nobody knew his past. At night, after Lily went to sleep, Mark worked on the car. That beaten muscle car everyone mocked. He bought it for $800 from a junkyard. Rusted frame, blown engine, torn seats. He stripped it down to the bones, rebuilt the frame, reinforced the structure, and then he installed something special. A prototype engine, his own design, compact hybrid system, high output, low consumption. Everything his old company refused to build safely. He was testing it, perfecting it, making it right. The car looked like junk on purpose. Nobody steals junk. Nobody asks questions about junk. It was his secret, his redemption. Meanwhile, at Orion Dynamics, things were changing. The old CEO retired 6 months ago. Elaine Carter took over in September. She came from a private equity background, sharp, ruthless, results-driven. She cut 12% of staff in her first month. People feared her. People respected her. But nobody really liked her. Elaine was focused on one thing, the Titan project, a $2 billion experimental engine, advanced combustion system, military contracts, government funding. If it worked, Orion would dominate the industry for decades. If it failed, the company would collapse. The demo was scheduled for today, investors flying in, defense contractors watching. Everything had to be perfect. The engineering team had been working 70-hour weeks, testing, retesting, adjusting parameters. The engine was temperamental, sensitive, unpredictable. Mark knew better. He had seen the design schematics in the trash one night. He recognized the architecture immediately. It was based on his old work, the same hybrid core, the same ignition sequence. But they had modified it, changed the safety protocols, removed redundancies to save weight and cost. Mark had seen this mistake before. At his old company, right before he got fired, he almost said something, but who would listen to a janitor? So he stayed quiet, stayed invisible, until that morning, 7:21 a.m., when Elaine mocked his car, when the alarm screamed, when the $2 billion engine died. Mark knew exactly what went wrong. The security team was shouting into radios, engineers sprinting toward the research wing. Elaine was already moving, heels clicking like gunfire on concrete. Mark followed, slow, steady, not running, not panicking, just walking. Lily was 9 now, smart, curious, Mark told her he was just fixing up an old car for fun. She called it Daddy's adventure car. Every night in that garage, tightening bolts, calibrating sensors. It was therapy. It was purpose. The car ran perfectly now. Everything his old company said was impossible. He had done it alone, with scrap parts, on a janitor's salary. Mark had submitted anonymous reports to Orion's safety department 3 times in the last 4 months. Warnings about the Titan engine design, all ignored, all filed away, because they came from an email with no credentials. As Mark walked through the corridors, he passed the employee wall. Photos of executives, engineers, department heads. His photo wasn't there. Janitors never made the wall. But in a few minutes, that wouldn't matter. Because after 6 years of being invisible, Mark Reynolds was about to be seen. The research wing was chaos. Red warning lights spinning across white walls. Alarm sirens screaming through the corridors. Engineers crowded around the main control panel. Screens flashing error codes in angry crimson. The Titan engine sat in the center of the test chamber. Massive, sleek, silent. $2 billion of cutting-edge technology, and it was dead. Chief Engineer David Park was sweating through his shirt, his hands shaking as he typed commands into the terminal. Nothing worked, nothing responded. The system was locked, frozen, unresponsive. Elaine burst through the security doors, her assistant scrambling behind her with a tablet. "Talk to me, David." David didn't look up from the screen. "Ignition sequence failed. Safety protocols engaged. The core is locked." Elaine's jaw tightened. "Unlock it." "We've tried every override command. Nothing. Try harder." David's voice cracked. "If we force restart now, we could damage the combustion chamber permanently." Elaine slammed her hand on the metal console. The sound echoed through the room. Everyone flinched. "We have investors arriving in 90 minutes. This engine needs to work. We're doing everything we can." Elaine turned to the rest of the team. 12 engineers, all frozen, all helpless. "Someone tell me how to fix this." Silence. Just the hum of computers and the distant wail of alarms. Mark stood in the doorway, gray uniform, cleaning badge, invisible. He watched the screens from 20 feet away. Error code 773, auxiliary valve pressure imbalance, secondary ignition loop offline. He knew this sequence. He had written the original safety protocol, the one they modified, the one they weakened. Mark took one step into the room. A security guard moved toward him. "Sir, authorized personnel only." Mark didn't stop walking. His eyes locked on the central display. "If you override now, the core temperature will spike." Every head in the room turned. David looked up from his terminal. "What?" Mark pointed at the screen. "Auxiliary valve. It's pressure locked. Your restart command bypasses the equalization cycle." David stared at him. "Who are you?" Elaine stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed. "You're the janitor." Mark nodded once. "Yes." "Get out." Mark didn't move. He pointed at the countdown timer on the main screen. 68 seconds. After 90 seconds, the safety lock becomes permanent. The core can't be recovered. David glanced at the timer, then back at Mark. "How do you know that?" "Because I designed the original system." The room went silent. Complete. Absolute. Silence. Even the alarm seemed quieter. Elaine stepped closer. "You're a janitor." "I was a lead engineer. Before." "Before what?" "Before I told my last company their shortcuts would fail. Before they fired me." Elaine looked at David. David looked at his team. Nobody spoke. The timer ticked down. 59 seconds. Elaine's voice was ice. "If you're lying to me, I'm not. If you damage that engine, I won't. We lose everything." Mark looked her straight in the eye. "You're about to lose it anyway." 52 seconds. David's hand hovered over his keyboard. "What do we do?" Mark walked to the console. The security guard grabbed his arm. Elaine raised one hand. "Let him through." The guard released him. Mark stood in front of the main terminal. His fingers moved across the keys. Calm, steady, certain. "You need to disengage the automatic restart sequence first." David hesitated. That's against protocol. Your protocol is what caused this. 41 seconds. Elaine's voice cut through the room. Do it. David typed the command. The restart sequence disengaged. Mark opened a secondary control panel. Lines of code scrolled across the screen. The auxiliary valve is hydraulically locked. You can't reset it electronically. Then how? Manual override. Valve chamber 3. Someone needs to release the pressure physically. David shook his head. That chamber is superheated right now. It's dangerous. Mark was already moving toward the chamber access door. I know. 33 seconds. Elaine called after him. Wait, why are you doing this? Mark paused at the door. He looked back at her. Because people could get hurt if this fails, and I've seen what happens when safety gets ignored. He opened the door and stepped into the valve chamber. The heat hit him like a physical wall, steam rising from the pressure lines, metal glowing dull red in the dim light. 28 seconds. Mark found valve chamber 3, a circular pressure wheel locked tight. He grabbed it with both hands. The metal was scorching hot. He gritted his teeth and pulled. Nothing. 22 seconds. He planted his feet and pulled harder, his palms burning. The wheel groaned, slowly, reluctantly. It began to turn. 16 seconds, one full rotation. 2, 3, a hiss of escaping pressure. The gauge needle dropped. 10 seconds. Mark spun the wheel faster, his hands screaming in pain. But he didn't stop. 6 seconds. The pressure equalized. Mark slammed the valve shut and ran back to the control room. 3 seconds. He burst through the door. Now, restart now. David hit the command. The screens flickered. 1 second. The Titan engine hummed. Low, deep, powerful. Then it roared to life. Smooth, perfect, flawless. The entire room exhaled. Engineers slumped against their workstations. Someone laughed. Someone else cheered quietly. David stared at the readings. It's stable. All systems nominal. Elaine stood perfectly still, her eyes on Mark. Mark's hands were bright red, blistered, shaking, but he was calm. Elaine walked over to him slowly. You saved $2 billion. Mark shook his head. I saved people. The money doesn't matter. She looked at his hands. Medical. Now. Mark nodded. He turned to leave. Elaine's voice stopped him. Mark. He looked back. Thank you. Mark nodded once and walked out of the room, the same way he came in. Quiet, steady, but no longer invisible. 2 hours later, Mark sat in the medical bay. A nurse wrapped bandages around his hands. 2nd-degree burns. Both palms. She worked carefully, gently. You should take at least 3 days off. Mark shook his head. I'll be fine. These burns are serious. I've had worse. The nurse sighed but didn't argue. She finished the bandages and gave him a bottle of painkillers. Mark thanked her and stood to leave. Elaine was waiting outside the door, arms crossed, face unreadable. We need to talk, Mark nodded. Okay. Not here. My office. They walked through the building in silence. Employees stared as they passed. The janitor walking with the CEO, whispers following them down every hallway. Elaine's office was on the top floor. Glass walls, city view, minimalist furniture. She closed the door behind them, gestured to a chair. Mark sat. Elaine didn't. She stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. I pulled your file. Mark said nothing. Mark Reynolds, lead engineer at TechCore Industries. 8 years ago, she turned to face him. You developed the original hybrid combustion prototype, the one that became the foundation for the Titan project. Yes. TechCore fired you. Yes. Why? Mark leaned back in the chair. I refused to cut safety protocols to meet their IPO deadline. They didn't like that. Elaine walked to her desk, opened a folder, pulled out a stack of printed emails. 3 months ago, someone sent anonymous reports to our safety department, warnings about structural vulnerabilities in the Titan design. She placed the papers on the desk between them. That was you. Mark looked at the reports, his own words, His own warnings. Yes. Why didn't you sign them? Would you have listened to a janitor? Elaine didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. She sat down across from him. The engineering team ran diagnostics after the restart. They found exactly what you warned about. Pressure imbalances, safety bypasses, structural weaknesses. Mark nodded slowly. It's the same mistake TechCore made, cutting corners to save time and money. Why didn't you say something sooner? Walk into David's office. Tell him directly. Mark looked at his bandaged hands. I tried that once. At my last job. It cost me everything. Elaine was quiet for a moment. You have a daughter. Lily, she's 9. You took this job for the healthcare. And because nobody asks questions, nobody expects anything. It's safe. Elaine stood up. Come with me. They left the office, took the elevator down to the parking garage, back to where the morning started. Mark's car was still there, beaten, rusted, mocked. Elaine walked around it slowly. This morning I called it junk. Mark smiled slightly. You weren't wrong. It looks terrible. Open the hood. Mark walked to the front of the car, popped the latch, lifted the hood. Elaine leaned in and froze. The engine inside was nothing like the rusty exterior. Polished aluminum, precision engineering, advanced hybrid components, compact, efficient, beautiful. Elaine stared. This is a working prototype, the one TechCore refused to build safely. She reached out but didn't touch it. You built this? Yourself? Over 6 years, nights and weekends, parts from junkyards and online suppliers. Does it work? Mark reached into the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine purred to life. Smooth, quiet, powerful, no smoke, no rattling, no hesitation. Elaine walked around to the side of the car, stared at the dashboard readings. Fuel efficiency? 87 miles per gallon equivalent. Emissions? Essentially zero. Power output? 340 horsepower. Elaine looked at him. This is impossible. No, it's what happens when you don't cut corners. She shook her head slowly. You've been driving a revolutionary engine prototype to work every day and parking it in our garage. Nobody looks twice at junk. Lane laughed, short, sharp, disbelieving. You built this on a janitor's salary. I built it because I had to prove something, to myself, that you weren't wrong, that safety and performance aren't opposites, that you can have both if you care enough. Elaine circled the car again. The Titan project, the $2 billion engine, it's based on your original design. A modified version, yes, but you perfected it here in a junkyard car with no budget, no team, no resources. Mark nodded. Elaine stopped walking, looked directly at him. Why did you save us today? After everything, after being ignored, mocked, invisible. Mark was quiet for a long moment. Because I've seen what happens when engines fail, when safety gets ignored. He looked away. My wife died in a car accident. Faulty brake system. The manufacturer knew about the defect, buried the reports, saved money instead of lives. Elaine's expression changed. Mark, I couldn't let that happen here. Not if I could stop it. Silence filled the garage. Just the soft hum of the prototype engine. Elaine took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. You didn't know. That's not an excuse. I judged you without seeing you, called your work junk without understanding it. Mark turned off the engine, closed the hood. You're not the first. You won't be the last. That doesn't make it right. She pulled out her phone, made a call. David, get down to the parking garage. Now, bring your best engineers. She hung up, looked at Mark. I want to offer you a position, Chief Safety Architect. You'll oversee all engine development, full authority over safety protocols. Mark shook his head. I appreciate it, but no. Elaine blinked. No? I have a daughter who needs me home for dinner, who needs help with homework, who draws pictures of her dad's adventure car. We can work around that. Can you? Because every company says that. Until deadline pressure hits, until costs need cutting, until safety becomes negotiable again. Elaine was quiet. What if I guarantee it? In writing? In your contract? Mark studied her face. Why do you care? Because you were right. About the engine. About the safety concerns. About everything. She gestured to the prototype. And because someone who builds this in a garage deserves better than being invisible. Mark looked at his bandaged hands, at the car that everyone mocked, at the CEO who finally saw him. I'll think about it. Elaine smiled. That's all I ask. The elevator opened. David and 3 engineers stepped out. They saw Mark, the open workspace, the tools scattered around. Then they saw the engine. David walked closer, his eyes widening with each step. Is this the prototype? Elaine said. The one Mark built, the one that actually works. The engineers crowded around, taking photos, asking questions, pointing at components. Mark stood back, watching them discover what he'd known all along. That junk is only junk if you refuse to see its value. And sometimes the most important innovations come from the people everyone overlooks. Elaine stood beside him. They're going to talk about this for months. Mark smiled. Let them. You're not invisible anymore, Mark. He looked at her. I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted to be heard. You're heard now. We'll see if it lasts. Elaine nodded. I'll make sure it does. 3 weeks later, Orion Dynamics held an emergency board meeting. Elaine stood at the head of the conference table. 12 board members, investors, legal counsel, all waiting. 3 weeks ago, we nearly lost the Titan project. $2 billion, 5 years of work, government contracts, everything. She clicked a remote. The screen behind her lit up. Security footage from the test chamber. The alarm, the panic, the countdown. Then Mark, walking in, saving everything. This man prevented catastrophe. His name is Mark Reynolds. She clicked again. Mark's employment record appeared. For 6 years, he worked here as a janitor. We paid him $16 an hour, gave him benefits, and never looked twice. The room was silent. Before that, he was a lead engineer. He designed the core technology that became our Titan engine. Another click. The anonymous safety reports appeared. He tried to warn us 3 times. We ignored him. Elaine set down the remote. I'm proposing immediate policy changes. First, we establish an anonymous safety reporting system with mandatory review. Second, we create a technical advisory board with real authority. Third, we implement work-life balance protections in all engineering contracts. One board member raised his hand. What does this cost us? Less than one catastrophic failure. Another member spoke up. What about Reynolds? What's he asking for? Elaine smiled slightly. He's asking to go home at 5 o'clock to have dinner with his daughter. Murmurs around the table. That's it? That's it. He turned down chief safety architect, turned down a corner office, turned down stock options. Why? Because he already lost everything once chasing a career. He won't do it again. The board chairman leaned forward. What are you proposing? We create a new position, safety engineering consultant, flexible hours, full benefits. He reviews all major projects. He has veto power on safety concerns. And he's home for dinner every night. That's unprecedented. So is having a janitor save your company. The chairman looked around the table. All in favor? Every hand went up. Elaine nodded. There's one more thing. She pulled out another file. I'm issuing a formal apology to Mark and to every employee we've overlooked. She looked directly at the board. We built a culture where people were afraid to speak up, where titles mattered more than truth, where a man with the answer to our problems spent 6 years mopping our floors. Silence. That ends today. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later. Elaine walked back to her office. Mark was waiting outside, still in his gray uniform, bandages off his hands now, pink scars visible. You didn't have to do all that. Elaine shook her head. Yes, I did. Come in. They sat in her office. She slid a contract across the desk. Safety engineering consultant, 30 hours a week, your choice of schedule, full medical, pension, and a formal apology from me, in writing, in front of the whole company. Mark read the contract carefully. You're serious about this? Completely. What if the board pressures you later? Deadlines, budgets, compromises. Then you remind me of this conversation, and I'll remind them what almost happened. Mark picked up a pen, signed the contract, slid it back. I'll need Wednesdays off. Lily has soccer. Elaine smiled. Wednesdays off. Done. She stood and extended her hand. Mark shook it. Welcome back, Engineer Reynolds. 2 days later, Orion held a company-wide meeting. Every employee gathered in the main auditorium. Elaine stood on stage. Mark sat in the front row, Lily beside him, curious, excited. I want to tell you about a mistake I made. Elaine's voice carried through the room. 3 weeks ago, I mocked someone's car, called it junk, dismissed him without a second thought. She pointed to Mark. That man saved this company, and I almost didn't let him. Saboteur. The room was completely silent. Mark Reynolds worked here for 6 years. We saw his uniform. We never saw him. She paused. Starting today, that changes. We're implementing open reporting systems. We're valuing truth over hierarchy. We're protecting people who speak up. Applause started slowly, then built. People standing. Mark didn't stand, didn't wave. He just smiled and squeezed Lily's hand. After the meeting, employees approached him, shaking his hand, thanking him, some apologizing for never noticing. David came over with his engineering team. We're starting a full safety review of all projects. We need your input. Mark nodded. Monday morning. I'll be there. What about your cleaning duties? Mark smiled. Someone else's job now. David laughed. Fair enough. As the crowd dispersed, Elaine found Mark and Lily. Your dad's pretty amazing. Lily beamed. I know. He built the adventure car. Elaine knelt down. He built a lot more than that. Lily looked up at Mark. Daddy, can we go see the big engine you fixed? Mark looked at Elaine. She nodded. I'll arrange a tour. They walked toward the exit together. Mark in his gray uniform one last time. Tomorrow he'd wear something different. But today he wore it with pride, because it represented every invisible person who ever had something important to say, and finally got heard. 1 year later, Orion Dynamics unveiled the Titan Mark II. The launch event filled the grand auditorium. Media cameras, investors, government contractors. Mark sat in the back row with Lily. No spotlight, no stage. Exactly how he wanted it. Elaine stood at the podium. This engine represents safety first, people first, truth first. She showed a slide of the old muscle car. This car taught us that value isn't always visible. Spotlight found Mark. The auditorium rose in applause. Lily squeezed his arm. Daddy, everyone's standing for you. Mark smiled but didn't stand. They're standing for what it represents. After the presentation, they walked to the company museum. The muscle car sat under dramatic lighting, polished but scarred. The plaque read, Prototype 0, the engine that changed everything. Lily pressed against the glass. They kept your car. Mark knelt beside her. It belongs to everyone who feels invisible now. Did people listen to you? Eventually, but I had to be brave first. She hugged him tight. Elaine approached. The board approved 5 more prototypes, global licensing. Tell them yes. Same safety standards, no exceptions. Already in every contract. She looked at the car. I still remember calling it junk. Mark smiled. Best mistake you made. It reminded me why I built it. 4 months later, a letter arrived from TechCore Industries, his former employer, facing catastrophic recalls now. Everything Mark warned them about. They offered chief engineering officer, triple salary, unlimited budget. Mark read it twice, filed it away, never responded. That evening, he picked Lily up from soccer. She ran to him, covered in mud. Daddy, I scored 2 goals. They stopped for ice cream, sat outside watching the sunset. Daddy, do you miss being famous? Mark laughed. People know the engine, not me. That's how I want it. Why? Because the engine is what I built. You're why I built it. Lily grinned, ice cream on her chin. I love you, Daddy. I love you too. More than any engine. They drove home as stars appeared. Mark tucked Lily into bed, read her favorite story, kissed her forehead goodnight. In his workshop, everything was organized. Tools hanging perfectly, workbench clear, no more midnight projects, just peace. His phone lit up. Elaine texted, Titan Mark II received full certification. We did it. Thank you. Mark smiled. We all did it. See you Monday. He turned off the workshop light, walked back inside, where his daughter slept safely, where his life made sense, where he was no longer invisible. Not because the world finally saw him, but because he finally saw what mattered. The engine didn't change Mark Reynolds. Mark Reynolds changed the engine. And in doing so, he changed everything. His daughter's future, his company's culture, his own understanding of success. 6 years mopping floors hadn't been wasted. It had been preparation for when being invisible became his greatest strength. When truth mattered more than titles. When saving lives meant more than saving face. Mark stood in his quiet living room. No awards on walls, no trophies on shelves, just family photos. Lily's drawings, a life well lived. That was more than enough. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories about fathers who sacrifice, about invisible people who matter, about second chances and quiet heroism, then subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten, the ones about everyday heroes, the ones that remind us value isn't always visible, but it's always there. Hit subscribe, and let's honor the invisible together.